Living is stressful. And I think animals that have managed to adapt to really stressful environments have a certain robustness and a certain resilience that translate into longevity.
Welcome, everyone. This is Buck Joffrey with the Longevity Roadmap. Today, got a really interesting show. One of the things that I think really makes me, confident that eventually we are going to find a way to fundamentally change how long we can live as a species, as humans, is the fact that if you go across species, there are species that just live a heck of a lot longer now, including mammals like whales, like the bowhead whale living 400 or 500 years. And the question is why, and what is it that's different about those kinds of animals that we can potentially apply to ourselves? And I'm not just talking about, what do whales eat and how do they exercise? What I'm talking about is their genetic makeup. And that's what I find really, really fascinating, because we already have the tools to manipulate human genomes, and we're not doing it yet. Some people are, by the way. I shouldn't say they're not doing it, but some people are doing it. They're going off different islands, getting different gene injections, and who knows how that turns out. But from the perspective of sort of accepted science and, research, it's not really being done yet. And what I do find this comparative biology space to be extremely interesting, because it brings up all sorts of possibilities. And that is what you're going to see with this conversation that I have today with Dr. Stephen Austad. He's one of the most important people when it comes to comparative biology and the biology of aging out there. We talk about a lot of interesting things, including, what is it about various animals that makes them live longer? What are some of the traits? What are some of the genetic differences? What can we learn from them? And ultimately, what can we apply from them potentially in the lab to fundamentally potentially change how long we live as a species? So really, really interesting discussion with Dr. Austad, and you're going to want to listen to this, and we'll have that interview right after these messages. Hey, longevity enthusiasts, it's time to take it to the next level. I've been fine-tuning my longevity regimen for years, and I look better and feel better than I did a decade ago. In fact, my blood work is even better than it was back then. And it's all because of my data-driven regimen, and it's inspired me to create a course and community just for you. It's called the Longevity Roadmap, and I urge you to check it out. If you're tired of your belly fat, tired of being tired, or just want to optimize yourself for the next 50 years, visit longevityroadmap.com. That's longevityroadmap.com. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Longevity Roadmap is Dr. Stephen Austad. He's one of the foremost authorities on the biology of aging, a distinguished professor and Protective Life Endowed Chair in Healthy Aging Research at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Dr. Austad also directs the Nathan Schock Center for Excellence in the Basic Biology of Aging and serves as Senior Scientific Director at the American Federation for Aging Research. He's published over 200 scientific articles and is the author of Why We Age and Methuselah's Zoo, which explores the extraordinary lifespans of certain animals and why they can teach us about extending human health span. Welcome to the show, Dr. Austad.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Well, let's start with the foundation here, which is, why do organisms age in the first place? Why didn't evolution just select for bodies that last forever?
That is a really good question. In fact, it's the question that got me into aging research initially. And I think the easy answer is that resources aren't infinite. We can't reproduce infinitely fast any more than we can live infinitely long. There has to be a trade-off in the energy that we take from the environment into maintaining our bodies or growing or reproducing, and you can't do all those things at once. And so evolution, of course, comes down in favor of anything that helps reproduction, and things that help reproduction aren't necessarily good for longevity. On a more immediate level, I like to say, aging is caused by eating and breathing. If we didn't eat, we didn't breathe, we wouldn't have, aging would not be a problem.
Sure.
But the message behind that is that it's basically the consumption of energy. Life itself is a sort of inherently damaging process. And what evolution has done is it's given us almost miraculous ways to combat the degenerative processes of living, but it's not perfect. And so ultimately, the damaging processes catch up with us.
So obviously, from species to species, there is different advantages. People or species are combating this better than others. So, what conditions does evolution favor slower aging and longer life?
Yeah, slower aging and longer life tend to evolve in species that live in very safe, very stable environments. All the longest lived species, animal species that we know about, for instance, live in the ocean. And you might think, well, why the ocean? Well, if you think about it, the ocean is a very stable environment. Rivers may come, rivers may go, lakes may dry up, new ones may come, but the ocean has been there for millions of years. And there are certain parts of the ocean that probably haven't changed appreciably for millions of years. And that's one of the source of conditions that really favors long life. Animals that live underground, that spend their lives underground, live longer than animals that live above ground. Animals that fly live longer than animals that don't fly. Now, you might say, well, what does flight have to do with it? Well, flight is a way that animals can travel a very long distance very quickly. And so the advantage of that is that if the local conditions deteriorate, animals can pick up and move 50 miles, 100 miles really quite easily, which, terrestrial animals can't. That would be a huge and time-consuming project for them.
Wasn't there also something related to metabolic rate that that people said that essentially species with higher metabolic rates tend to live shorter lives?
Right. And that's true. And so that's another way to have a longer life is to have a lower metabolic rate. I mean, in fact, it used to be thought that the metabolic rate was the thing that determined aging, that basically your longevity was your metabolic rate. We've learned that it's more complicated than that. But metabolic rate really is just measuring the life processes that are going on in you. So you can imagine that if those are going on fast, the damage will accumulate fast.
Yeah.
And if they're going on slow, then it will accumulate slowly. The interesting thing is that there are some species that seem to be able to combine a fast life and a long life.
Like bats, for example, I think is that one?
Bats, hummingbirds, have more heartbeats in a couple of months than humans would have in their lifetime.
Yeah. Interesting. So there's this idea that some have that aging is somehow, when we're talking about humans or any other species, programmed, that is built into us. I believe you disagree with this. So tell us why.
Yeah, I do disagree. And part of it depends on, well, how do you find a program? I think of a program as something like a computer algorithm, right? That certain amount of time passes, certain things will happen. That doesn't describe aging at all the way we know it.
Right.
To give you an example, I could have 100 mice in my lab that were genetically identical, that had spent their lives in exactly the same environment, eating exactly the same food. Some will die at 10 months of age of a liver tumor. Some of them will live 3 years and die of something unrelated to tumors at all. So to me, if something really were programmed, if aging were programmed, then it would happen quite similarly, particularly in organisms that are genetically identical and live in the same environment.
Yeah. In some ways, it seems like rather than, I guess part of the, when I think about programming, and I don't think this is really programming, but for example, you brought the attention of this idea with higher metabolic rates. For example, mitochondria producing oxidative species at a higher rate, damaging cells. It's a kind of self-inflicted decay but it's not
Very
real,
much.
right?
Yeah.
But it's not programmatic. It's more, I guess, just just sort of a long term deterioration, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, you think of it this way that mitochondria produce reactive oxygen species. One of the things that they damage a lot of things. One of the things they damage is DNA. But only 1 to 2% of our DNA is making proteins. So they could be doing a lot of damage in parts of your DNA that didn't matter. But sometimes they hit DNA in a really critical spot. And so there's a certain randomness to aging that I don't think we can escape from.
Yeah. Well, you've actually, I think, just using that line of reasoning, suggested that studying centenarians may not be the most efficient way to look at the aging process, because they are essentially, one-offs, right? We're not really looking at a big population of advantages.
Yeah, I think if you're going to look at centenarians, I think you want to look at families, long life families, because you know, any person could potentially, if they're just lucky, could live to be 100 years old. But if there's a family that many of them are living to be 100 years old, then they probably have some genetic advantage that it would be useful to learn what that genetic advantage is.
Sure.
For instance, a friend of mine, one of the studies centenarians, one of the families, there are five siblings, and they all lived to be, at least 102 years old. And that's, that there's no way to explain that by luck.
Yeah, and that gets me sort of to biological mechanisms that various species or even within individuals might have that evolved to extend life and resist disease. I mean, in humans, you hear about various genes, the FOXO genes and that kind of thing. Um, Tell us a little bit about the types of biological mechanisms that seem to extend life.
Well, the things that seem to extend life, except just slowing down the pace of living, which we can't really do that. And within a species, also the lessons are dangerous. There was an early aging researcher, Raymond Pearl, who thought that metabolic rate explained everything, and he even wrote a paper called "Why Lazy People Live the
Right.
Longest." And if that were the case, you'd expect that the gyms would be empty,
Well,
and the people that never
mhm.
went to the gym would be the people that live the longest. He died at 61 of a heart attack. Um,
That's a quick way to
so
disprove your own theory, I guess.
yeah, exactly. But Ross, I mean, this is one of the things that evolution does. So Ross of these damaging byproducts of metabolism, but they're also useful in cell signaling to one another. So for the longest time, we thought, well, all we need to do is knock down the level of reactive oxygen species in the body. And if we can do that, we'll stay healthy longer and live longer. Well, it turned out it was complicated because those molecules are actually signaling molecules too. So we were basically inhibiting important cellular signaling. So it turned out that very nice, plausible idea just didn't work out in a real biological system.
Yeah, I think another one that I think about frequently is the role of mTOR, right? mTOR, this is we've talked about it on the show a number of times, essentially a protein that regulates whether or not, you're going to sort of be in this growth mode, or if you're going to, buckle down and clean up house with getting rid of, cells that are not useful, senescent cells. But what's interesting to me is that despite the fact that downregulating mTOR seems to, across species, help with longevity, that one of the biggest activators of mTOR is exercise. So there you go, right? You've got the same kind of thing, which makes it very confusing.
Yeah, and I think that's an important lesson. And I have to say that what we know about mTOR in terms of its benefits for health and longevity all come from organisms that are living in a laboratory. And one of the things that we know that mTOR inhibition does is it compromises immune function. And so in the real world, that's going to be important. We don't live in germ-free laboratories. We live in environments where having a really robust immune system is important, and having muscles that are strong is important, right? So I think we're easily misled by the laboratory environment, because that's where
Yeah.
basically all biomedical research goes on. And we tend to forget that the environment that we live in is different in many, many aspects.
So when it comes to species that are of interest, when it comes to research and application to humans, which species are you most interested in? Like what animals pop out when you look at them and say, gosh, there could be something there that's useful to us?
Um, well, the group that pops out that just seem to escape everybody's attention is the birds. And I say that because they're one of the groups that can combine a really high metabolic rate with a long life. So there are birds that are the size of small cats that live over 70 years, and they live over 70 years in the wild. And I think that's an important consideration, because in the wild, there's all kinds of environmental dangers. There's dangers from predators. There's dangers from storms. There's all kinds of things. And so you don't live a long time in the wild unless you stay healthy a long time in the wild. It's very, very different than a mouse in a cage in my laboratory, which simply has to crawl over to the food dish to eat. That's everything it needs to do to stay alive.
What do we know about, I guess, at the cellular level or the genetic level about, those kinds of birds that we can potentially start to extrapolate some information?
Well, that's the problem. We know virtually nothing about them because no one has studied them. But the reason they're interesting, they not only have a high body metabolic rate, they have a high body temperature. Their body temperature is 104, 105, 106. They also have fairly astronomical levels of blood glucose. They would all be diabetic if they were humans. How do they handle that? Um, it's a big unanswered question, and I think part of it's due to the fact that birds are just too common. We don't have any respect for animals that we see all the time. But I think the most common bird in the world is a house sparrow, which we have every place in the world except for Antarctica, and they're the size of a mouse, but they can live 20 years in the wild, and a mouse lives about a year in the wild.
Now, there are species out there that are a little bit better studied. I think like the bowhead whale, I think there's a fair amount of research there. And what do we know about some of the genetic differences? I mean, these days with longevity research, it seems like there's a number of genes that have been identified as potential players in longevity. For example, the sirtuin genes. We've talked about mTOR, various genes like that. What do we know about, when you look at a species that we've actually studied that lives for a long time, what differences do we see there?
Well, I think the species that we know the most about, that I would call a long life species, well, except for ourselves, we forget that we're very, very successful at aging. There's no other mammal that lives on land that lives as long as we do. But the one we know most about, I'd say, is the naked mole rat,
Mm-hmm.
simply because we've been studying it for the longest time. And first of all, it has a low metabolic rate, so that helps. It tends to have a lot of resistance to cancer. That helps. We think we might even know something about why it's cancer resistant. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, living is stressful. And I think animals that have managed to adapt to really stressful environments have a certain robustness and a certain resilience that translate into longevity. And naked mole rats live far underground in colonies, which means that the level of oxygen is very low. the level of carbon dioxide is very high. We would die if we were living in a naked mole rat colony from, hypoxia. And yet they managed to do just fine. And I think it might be the adaptations to that hypoxia that really has set the stage. And of course, the environment, they live underground at the equator. So that's about as stable an environment as you'll find anywhere.
Yeah. When you think about the future of, what we're trying to use some of this information for when it comes to human longevity or health span, well, let's just say that one of the things that really intrigues me, Dr. Austad, is this idea that maybe someday, I'm not talking about anytime soon, that we could use some of the genetic technologies that we have, like we've discovered, like CRISPR or something like that, and start using those technologies in combination with what we learn about animals, about species that live a long time. Let's just say, for example, and I'm not, this is a total simplification, but we learned that CERT6 was a major player in human longevity, and that there was a way to use CRISPR technology or some sort of DNA technology to essentially, put those into humans and allow for, better health span, lifespan. What are your thoughts on that? And how far is there people looking into that? What's the research there, and what are some of the potential genes that people are looking at right now?
Oh yeah, I mean that a lot of people are looking at that, and the technology is there. I mean, we could do this if we could get the studies approved, and if we had the volunteers that were willing to do it. Now, the big unanswered question is what the side effects would be. I think when we develop techniques that allow us to live substantially longer, they're going to have side effects. I think it's naive to assume that we could affect something as deeply rooted in human biology as aging and not expect it to do anything else. So my guess is we're going to also have interventions to manage the side effects.
Sure.
I don't think that's an unsolvable problem. I just think it's a problem that people can easily overlook. No, I think this is entirely plausible. The technology is close to being there already. But I mean, there are all kinds of ethical issues with
Sure.
it for starters. But I fully expect that that there will, people are ready, right? They're getting unapproved, follistatin, genes. So this is going to happen. And, to the extent that people are willing to experiment on themselves, that's great. What I don't know is if it's unregulated, what we're going to learn from it, right? There are a lot of people doing a lot of interesting stuff. There are people taking rapamycin because they think it's going to keep them healthy longer, and maybe they're right, And there are people getting these, the follistatin, gene injection.
Is that the most common thing that you've seen? Tell the audience a little bit about that, if you would. Just
So this is basically a gene that will build muscle, and I mean, we know lots of ways to build muscle already, but this will do it probably better than any of those ways. And there are places that you can go, and you will have people inject you with basically follistatin genes that are designed to get into your cell nuclei and have an effect. The problem is, what kind of follow-up are we going to have? These are, well, what if this person dies in 12 years? What if all the people that get this die in 12 or 15 years from some disease? If this is not any kind of controlled trial, we won't learn about that.
Yeah.
So I'm a little concerned that this stuff is going on in such an unregulated way when we could be learning quite a bit from it if it were going on in a regulated way. Because like I said, I do think it's quite interesting.
I mean, in the case of follistatin, I've the thing that from a physician standpoint, what I think of right away is well, is that going to make my cardiac muscle going to grow too? And then the next thing you know, I end up with, cardiomyopathies and that kind of thing. So
Exactly.
yeah,
And that's the kind of thing that makes biology complicated,
yeah.
right?
What are some of the other genes? I mean, are people looking at some of the longevity genes out there and like those kinds of things with sirtuins and are they
36, people are fooling around with 36. I'm sure people are fooling around with FOXO 3A. There are lots of things, and more coming out. The trouble with there's almost none of these genes that we know to be advantageous in all scenarios.
yeah.
One of the things that the people studying centenarians who've been looking for these longevity genes for a long time have trouble finding genes that seem to work in all populations. This one works in, Ashkenazi Jews, but doesn't work
Yeah.
in Germans or doesn't work in Chinese and I think that that's because genes and environments interact. And whether good genes for you depends on the environment that you live in and the environment that you've lived through. But I think your point about unintended consequences of things that seem like a great idea right off the bat is a really important one. And we've got to learn about those things. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to learn about them from just, I'm fine with people who want to experiment on their own bodies. That's fine. I'd like it though, if we could learn something. From
What's
what they're doing.
limiting that? I mean, what's limiting our ability to? I can look at like something like follistatin might be really useful for the as a trial on elderly who are having severe sarcopenia and what do you got to lose that type?
Right. Well, I mean, what's inhibiting it is regulations, is basically getting approval. It's only recently that treatments for sarcopenia could get FDA approved, and I think follistatin would be good. You'd have to, but the thing is, and here's the key thing: it's quite possible that we'll find things that work to benefit the health of people that are already compromised. But I think a lot of the people who are most interested in this are people who are healthy, and they're interested in staying healthy. And making somebody that's got severe sarcopenia a little bit stronger is not necessarily the same as taking to someone that's already works out daily at the gym and making them stronger.
Right. So if you had to, let's say you had to bet on a biological system for extending human health span, based on what you know about across the species, what have you seen in nature that what would it be for humans? I mean, you're not gonna, as much as we've talked about metabolic rate, we also talked about why it's not necessarily practical for humans. So like what traits are what systems do you think that might be the most promising to address?
Well, I think the thing that looks the most promising now is basically glucose control. The GLP-1s turn out to, seems like every time you turn around, you find a new benefit from those. And because so many people are taking them, even though they haven't been around that long, we know a lot about them, and they seem to have tremendous benefits, at least for people that are obese or diabetic or pre-diabetic. What we really don't know yet is what they do for people that are healthy to start off with, are really healthy to start off with. But I really like to know that. But from what we do know, those look to me like the most promising things. And the reason I say that is because the evidence is in people, not in mice. Mice don't translate very well to people. Some things do, most things don't. But for the GLP-1s, there's a ton of human data.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think like glucose control, in my view, it's the single most important thing to human longevity. But so in that regard, it's almost sort of low hanging fruit. I mean, we're talking about genetics and CRISPR and all this stuff, but the reality is, like, really strict glucose control has proven to create significant benefits to health span and probably lifespan as well.
Absolutely. It's one more reason that I think the birds are so interesting because, with horrifically high levels of blood glucose, they seem to do fine. How they manage that is really intriguing.
Yeah. I'd be curious, is their hemoglobin different? It must be different than ours, and that might have an impact because
It's somewhat different. It's somewhat different, but it's still easily recognizable as hemoglobin. Their red blood cells have nuclei, so they're different than our red blood cells as well. But they need that high level of blood glucose from the high metabolic rate they need for powered flight, which is the most physically demanding thing we know about. Um, but I think glucose control. It's almost we've known about the importance of glucose control for a long time. I mean, 1993, Cynthia Kenyon discovers DAF2 worms live twice as long. And what's DAF2? It's an insulin receptor. And, the earliest mouse models of longevity were all models that produced IGF. But I think we kind of forgot about that. And then suddenly the GLP-1s come out of nowhere. They come out of the diabetes field and they have these remarkable effects. That's where I would put my money at this point.
yeah, and I've also believed personally that's probably why we've seen benefits from metformin in larger trials. I know there is initial trials suggesting that even non-diabetics who were not on metformin, didn't live as long as diabetics on metformin, which there was some follow-up studies on that, which made it seem less likely to be the case. But metformin, I bet the likely mechanism there is simply good control of blood sugar, right?
Absolutely agree with you. And even if it doesn't lead to longer life, there's all kinds of suggestions that it does have benefits, for treating infectious diseases like COVID-19.
In the case of GLP-1s, one of the challenging things there has been muscle mass reductions up to 30% in some people. What do you think of that in terms of longevity?
Well, I think that's a problem. But it's also the same thing you find with the mTOR inhibitors, right? It seems to be one of those trade-offs. Now, can we do something, follistatin plus
Yeah.
GLP-1s?
Well, I
I
think
don't know
there's something. I think there's a monoclonal antibody that they're
yeah,
working on. I think it's like I don't know how you pronounce something like bimagrumab or something like that. That they're trying to put together with this that targets activin type 2 receptors. So who knows? But
yeah, like I say, I
yeah.
think we're going to end up with ignoring, genetic modification. I think we're going to end up with drugs to combat the side effects of the other drugs because, biology's complex. And I like to say if it were simple, it would be physics. But
Yeah, right. Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, this is why I think the people that are most, I'd say, giddily optimistic about living longer tend to be engineers. They tend to be engineers rather than, I'd say, physicians. Physicians appreciate the complexity, I think, of the body in a way that uh, engineers, they have certain designs, and this is how you fix the design, and it's fairly easy. They don't work with systems that have lots of feedback.
My one question I have for you is, okay, we've just talked about optimizing blood sugar, and you can do a lot of these things that are not going to involve manipulation of the genome. If you do everything right, what do you think is really sort of the current thought on how long a human being can actually live?
Well, I think if everybody did everything absolutely the best way, I think we could probably reach a life expectancy in the 90s, maybe even 100. but that's not going to increase the upper limit all that much. Maybe
Yeah.
we get to 130
Yeah.
years. It's going to take something more than lifestyle
Yeah.
modification to get us beyond that. But we know, I mean, it's just from looking at evolution, we know that basically longevity can get greater, lesser. If evolution can do it, we should be able to figure out how evolution does it and mimic it in some way.
And I think therein lies sort of the value of what you're doing and what others are doing in the lab, which is, if we can try to figure out, apart from just living healthy and exercising and trying to optimize blood sugar, there is a pathway potentially through science, through manipulation of the genome, to potentially extend that maybe another 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that we have learned. We've learned for sure that aging can be modified. And in simple animals in a laboratory setting, we're pretty good at it.
Now tell us about that, because I think I've heard that a few times, and I've heard it disputed as well. Is there actual manipulations, genetic manipulations that have created lifespans in animals that are above and beyond what you would expect for that animal?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Ames dwarf mouse, was lived longer than any mice that we know about, and in many ways seemed healthier during that life. Now, again, there were some side effects. They're cold sensitive, right? But they're very, very insulin sensitive as well. We've doubled the lifetime of fruit flies. We've increased the lifespan of worms by as much as tenfold. The thing that gives me pause is that if you look at our experimental systems, if you go from worms to flies to mice, the longer the animal lives, the smaller the impact we've been able to have on its longevity. So now you scale that up to humans, right? And that's why we just don't know what the possibilities are yet for humans. But we do know that we can change the way that a mouse ages, that a fly ages, and we can slow it down, and we can improve a lot of things, a lot of aspects of health. Not everything, because again, it's biology. There's trade-offs. All the genetic manipulations that we know that extend life, reduce reproduction, or slow development, or do a couple of other things. That doesn't mean they're not translatable. If they inhibit reproduction and we don't start doing it until after we're finished reproducing,
Right.
then it's not a problem. But I think we really have killed the myth that you can't change aging, that a species is fixed in whatever nature has endowed it with right now.
So using sort of this reasoning that if you can do it in a lab, you can do it for humans. What do you think the realistic timeline of meaningful changes, like meaningful things that are available to human beings, might be? Is this something that we're talking about a decade? Are we talking about 2 or 3 decades? What do you think?
Well, I've been saying a decade to 2 decades for several decades. So,
Well, now
but
you've got a lot of, things have
right,
really gone up
yeah,
exponentially, and then you have
there's more things
AI.
than ever before.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a much larger armamentarium than we ever had in the past. It used to be all we had was dietary restriction, and then we had these genes, but now we have new diets potentially, and now we have a basket full of drugs, and now we have genetic manipulations that we never used to think we'd be able to do this in people, but now we know there are ways to do it. There are ways to do it safely. So I do think within a couple of decades, we'll have some people, probably the billionaires that are footing the bill for this are going to have possibility of staying young substantially longer. I think it'd be a lot longer than that before it sort of dribbles down to most people. but I think it will eventually. Kidney dialysis used to be unaffordable, for, and eventually became available to pretty much anybody who needs it.
Age reversal versus not aging. What are your thoughts there? I mean, I've spoken to Aubrey de Grey, for example, who's an interesting guy, very smart guy, and an engineer, by the way. So to your point about that,
I was going to point that out.
Yeah. I do find it fascinating the concept that Aubrey says is that age reversal is not necessarily any more difficult than the idea of slowing aging. I mean, it is curious. What are your thoughts there?
Oh, I think he's dead wrong on that. I think reversing aging is about as difficult as reversing time, and that's pretty difficult. Part of it depends on what you mean, of course, by reversing aging. If I've never gone to the gym and I suddenly start working out, my muscles are going to be stronger a year from now, even though I'm a year older. But have I reversed my aging muscles? Well, no. If you look at the muscle cells, if you look at the tendons, if you look at the DNA damage, you haven't reversed aging. You simply improve the function, which is fine.
Well, I think the part of that thought has come from, David Sinclair has talked a lot about Yamanaka factors and the promise of Yamanaka factors, that kind of thing. So I think a lot of it stems from that concept.
I do too. And I think it's a concept, but I don't think it's a concept that applies kind of on the level of the cell, but not on the level of the body at all. I can easily see, taking a skin cell and turning it into an embryonic stem cell. That we know how to do that quite well. And you could say, well, that's a younger cell. And I would say, well, maybe it's a differentiated cell. If it had damage, if it had mutations in its DNA, you haven't reversed those. You may have just turned it into a nice tumor progenitor, which is not to say that I don't think that the reprogramming is not an interesting idea and promises a path forward. I just thinking of as reversing aging violates so many tenets of basic biology that I can't begin to describe them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, it's been absolutely fascinating to speak with you today, Dr. Austad. I really do appreciate you joining the program.
Well, thanks. It's nice speaking with you as well. You asked some really interesting questions. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Thanks for listening. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.